All right, let's jump right into this deep dive. We're taking a look at molecular dynamics simulations. And, those are basically using computers to simulate how atoms and molecules move around over time.
Yeah.
And the listeners brought us some really interesting research papers on this topic, specifically on force fields, which are like the set of rules that govern how those atoms interact in a simulation.
It's like the instruction manual for the atoms.
Exactly. And we're going to try to figure out what's really important about them and why they can be kind of a headache sometimes. Like, did you know that scientists will sometimes intentionally make hydrogen bonds disappear in their models?
It sounds crazy, but it can actually be really helpful.
Yeah, we'll get into that. And then there's this whole thing about simulating a simple molecule like ethane.
Right.
It can get surprisingly complicated, like way more than you'd think.
Ethane! Really? I wouldn't have guessed that.
I know, right? And then there's the question of whether a force field can actually be too accurate.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
I know, right? It's going to be a wild ride.
I'm ready. Where do we start?
Well, I think first we got to make sure we're all on the same page.
Right.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is a force field in the context of these MD simulations?
Okay, so imagine you're playing a video game, and the physics engine determines how objects move and collide.
Yeah.
A force field is kind of like that physics engine, but for atoms and molecules.
So it's the set of rules that determines how our atoms behave, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a set of equations and also these things called parameters.
Okay.
And together, they basically dictate how atoms interact in the simulation.
So it's like we're setting the stage for our little atomic play.
Yeah.
But in the real world, atoms are governed by quantum mechanics, which is way more complex than just a set of rules, right?
It is. Quantum mechanics is really complicated stuff.
So how do we simplify that into a force field?
Well, that's the clever part. Scientists have found ways to use mathematical functions that approximate the forces we see in quantum mechanics. It's kind of like creating a simplified set of rules that capture how atoms behave without getting bogged down in all those nitty-gritty details.
Right. Makes sense. So it's kind of like a cheat sheet for atoms.
In a way, yeah. And these cheat sheets have allowed us to do some pretty amazing things with MD simulations.
Absolutely. So what are the basic ingredients, the key elements that go into a force field?
Good question. We can break them down into two main types.
Okay.
Bonded interactions and non-bonded interactions.
Okay. Bonded interactions. That sounds pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, so bonded interactions describe the forces between atoms that are directly connected by a chemical bond.
Okay.
It's kind of like they're holding hands.
Cute.
So you can kind of picture those atoms holding hands, and they're connected by little springs.
Right.
And those springs represent the bonds. They have certain properties like stiffness and an equilibrium length. And those bonded interactions, they model things like bond stretching, angle bending, and dihedral rotations. Basically all the ways those connected atoms can move around.
So if we pull on those atoms or try to bend that angle between them, the force field tells us how much that should cost, like in terms of energy, right?
Exactly. It's like those virtual springs are resisting the change.
And so by adjusting how stiff those springs are, we can really fine-tune how our molecules behave.
Exactly. It's one of the ways we make those simulations as realistic as possible.
Very cool. So we've got these bonded interactions. What about these non-bonded ones?
So non-bonded interactions are a little trickier to visualize. They describe how atoms that aren't directly bonded to each other still interact with each other.
So they're not holding hands, but they're still kind of feeling each other's vibes.
Exactly. It's like they're aware of each other's presence even from a distance.
Got it. So what are the main players in this non-bonded world?
Well, there are two big ones, the Lennard-Jones potential and Coulomb's law.
Oh, I remember Coulomb's law from physics class.
Yeah.
Refresh my memory on what these actually mean for our atoms.
Yeah. Okay, so the Lennard-Jones potential, it describes this sort of push and pull between atoms. At really close distances, atoms repel each other strongly. Their electron clouds start overlapping, and nobody likes that.
Yeah, personal space is important, even for atoms.
Right, but as you move those atoms slightly further apart, there's this weak attraction between them. It's like finding that sweet spot where they're not too close, but not too far apart either.
So it's this balancing act between wanting to maintain a little distance, but also feeling a bit of a pull.
Precisely. Then there's Coulomb's law, which is all about the forces between charged atoms.
Right, opposites attract and all that.
Exactly. Just like magnets, positive charges repel other positives, negatives repel negatives, but positives and negatives, they attract each other.
Makes sense. So we've got these equations and all these parameters.
Right.
But how do scientists actually determine what the correct parameters are for a specific molecule?
That's the art of parameterization. And it's a crucial part of developing a force field. They basically use a combination of experimental data and some serious quantum mechanical calculations to try and figure out those best values.
So they might start by looking at experimental data, like how long are those bonds, how much energy does it take to vibrate them?
Exactly. They might also look at the density of the molecule, its heat of vaporization, things like that.
So it's like gathering clues from the real world to try and build a model that matches, right?
Absolutely. But experimental data can only take us so far. To really fine-tune those parameters, they have to go deeper and look at it from that quantum mechanical perspective.
Because quantum mechanics gives us a more fundamental understanding of how those electrons are behaving and influencing those forces.
You got it. So they might use quantum mechanical calculations to figure out things like, what are the partial charges on each atom?
Okay.
What are the energy barriers to rotating around different bonds?
So it's like we're using quantum mechanics to get a high-resolution picture of our molecule and then using that to refine our force field parameters.
Exactly. And it's a constant back and forth. You tweak those parameters, compare it to experimental data, refine using quantum calculations, and then you tweak it again, and so on.
That sounds like a lot of work.
It is, but it's worth it to get those force fields as accurate as possible.
And I imagine different force fields might have different strengths and weaknesses, right?
You're exactly right. It's like choosing the right tool for the job.
Right.
You wouldn't use a hammer to screw in a screw. So, for example, you have the amber force field that's widely used for simulating proteins and nucleic acids. And then there's the charm force field. That one's popular for simulating lipids and membranes.
So some are better suited for biological molecules. Others might be great for modeling materials.
You got it. But no matter which force field you choose, there are always challenges in capturing those nuanced molecular interactions.
Speaking of challenges, I keep seeing this thing called 1,4 of 4 non-bonded interactions pop up in these papers.
Ah, yes.
What's so tricky about those?
The 1-force-4 dilemma. It refers to interactions between atoms that are separated by 3 bonds.
Okay.
So you have 2 atoms that are connected, but they're not holding hands directly. They've got 2 other atoms in between them.
So like distant relatives on the molecular family tree.
That's a good way to put it. And these 1-4 interactions are tough to model because they're influenced by both those bonded and non-bonded forces that we talked about.
So they're kind of stuck in a tug-of-war between 2 different types of interactions.
Exactly. The bonded forces want them to behave one way, and the non-bonded forces are pulling them in a different direction.
I can see how that would be confusing for an atom.
It is. Different force fields tackle this 1-4 challenge in different ways.
Right.
But there's no perfect solution. A common approach is to use these scaling factors to adjust the strength of those interactions, but it's really delicate. You don't want to mess up the balance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, you know, the papers keep bringing up this molecule, the alanine dipeptide,
Oh, yeah.
as a classic example of how those 1,4 interactions can really make a difference.
It's a great example.
What makes that molecule so sensitive to the force field?
Well, for one thing, the alanine dipeptide is super flexible. It's got 2 peptide bonds,
Okay.
and the angles around those bonds can rotate. So the molecule can adopt all these different shapes.
It's like a tiny contortionist.
Exactly. And as it twists and turns into all those different shapes, its energy changes.
Right.
But those energy changes are really sensitive to how the force field is handling those 1-4 interactions. So you could choose one force field,
Yeah.
and the alanine dipeptide might be doing a certain dance,
Right.
but you choose a different force field, and it's doing a whole different set of moves,
Even though it's the same molecule.
even though it's the same molecule.
Yeah.
So it really highlights why you've got to pick the right force field
Right.
for the system you're trying to study.
It's like we're choreographing these little atomic dances.
Exactly. And we need to make sure we're giving our dancers the right instructions.
Otherwise, the whole performance could fall apart.
That's a great way to put it.
This is so interesting. It's amazing how subtle these force fields can be.
Yeah.
And we haven't even gotten to long-range forces yet,
Oh, yeah.
which I feel like is a whole other level of complexity.
It is. But you know what? We've covered a lot of ground already.
We have.
Maybe it's time to take a little break,
Yeah.
refuel those mental engines,
All right.
and then we can come back and tackle the mysteries of long-range forces.
That sounds good to me.
All right, sounds good.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll be back in a flash to dive even deeper into the world of force fields.
Looking forward to it. All right, so we're back and ready to dive even deeper into this world of force fields.
You know, it's just amazing to me that we can actually simulate these tiny movements of atoms and molecules on a computer.
It is pretty incredible when you think about it.
But like we were saying before, choosing the right force field and making sure those parameters are just right.
Right.
It's crucial, and it's not easy.
It really is an art, as much as it is a science.
You know, it's kind of like trying to come up with the perfect recipe for some really complicated dish, right?
That's a good analogy.
You need to know exactly which ingredients to use, how much of each, and how to combine them to make sure it all comes out just right.
Yeah, and if you get even one thing wrong,
Yeah,
the whole thing can be a disaster.
exactly. And speaking of recipes, something you mentioned earlier that really stuck with me was this idea that sometimes scientists actually make hydrogen bonds disappear in their simulations.
Oh, yeah.
Which sounds completely crazy to me. Hydrogen bonds are so important in all sorts of molecular interactions.
They are.
Why on earth would you want to make them vanish?
I know it seems counterintuitive, but there's actually a really good reason for it.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Well, you have to remember the different time scales we're dealing with in these MD simulations. Some things happen super fast.
Yeah. Like bond vibrations happen on the order of femtoseconds.
Right. Ridiculously fast.
Whereas other processes like protein folding can take milliseconds or even seconds.
So it's like comparing the blink of an eye to like the slow growth of a tree.
Exactly. It's a huge difference in scale.
Huge.
And those super fast motions, like those hydrogen bond vibrations, they can really limit how big of a time step we can take in our simulations.
Okay.
If we try to take too big a step, the simulation might become unstable, like a car trying to take a corner too fast.
It'll spin out of control.
Exactly.
So by essentially freezing those hydrogen bonds in place, we're taking those rapid vibrations out of the equation, which lets us use larger time steps.
You got it. And in many cases, it doesn't actually affect the overall results of the simulation, especially if we're dealing with a large system or processes that happen over a longer time.
Okay.
It's like focusing on the overall choreography of the dance rather than every tiny muscle twitch of the dancers.
So we're simplifying things a bit.
But in a way that still gives us meaningful results.
Exactly. It's all about finding the right balance between accuracy and efficiency.
So we're not sacrificing accuracy.
No.
We're just choosing the right level of detail for the question we're trying to answer.
Precisely. It's like you wouldn't use a microscope to study the movements of planets.
Right.
You wouldn't use a telescope to examine bacteria.
Makes sense.
Okay.
All right, so before the break, we were just about to dive into the world of long-range forces and why those need some special treatment in MD simulations.
Yeah.
Can you remind us why that is again?
Okay. Imagine you're simulating a box of water molecules. You might think that the water molecules on opposite sides of that box, their interactions wouldn't be very strong.
Right, because they're so far apart.
Exactly. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
Makes sense to me.
But here's the thing. In MD simulations, we often use something called periodic boundary conditions.
Okay.
So imagine that your box of water is actually surrounded by an infinite number of identical boxes, like a molecular hall of mirrors.
Whoa, so our water molecules have infinite clones.
Exactly. And because of those periodic boundary conditions,
Okay.
a water molecule in our box can actually see and interact with water molecules in those neighboring boxes, even the ones that are really far away.
Ah. So even though those distant molecules seem far away in our little box, they're actually way closer than we think.
Yeah.
Because of that Hall of Mirrors effect.
Precisely. And this means that we can't just ignore those long-range interactions.
I can see how that would be a problem.
If we did, our simulation would be totally inaccurate.
So we have to find a way to account for them.
Right.
But with making our computers explode from trying to calculate the interactions between every single molecule and its infinite clone.
Exactly. And that's where some really clever techniques come in.
Okay.
One of the most common is called Ewald summation.
Ewald summation.
It's a bit mathy, but the basic idea is to split those electrostatic interactions into two parts.
Okay.
A short-range part that we can calculate directly, and a long-range part that we can handle in a much more efficient way.
So we're basically dividing and conquering.
Yeah.
Dealing with those long-range forces in chunks rather than all at once.
Exactly. And Ewald summation uses some pretty fancy math to take advantage of that periodic nature of our system. So we can approximate those long-range interactions without having to calculate every single one individually.
That's so clever.
It is. It's one of those things that makes you really appreciate the ingenuity of the scientists who developed these methods.
Yeah. It's like we're kind of cheating a little bit.
In a way.
To get the right answer without doing all the work.
But it's a smart kind of cheating.
Exactly. All right, so we've tackled short-range forces, long-range forces. I feel like we're really getting a handle on how these force fields work.
I think so, too.
But, something we haven't talked about yet that might seem really basic, but I'm sure is also surprisingly complex to simulate.
What's that?
Temperature and pressure.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Why is it important to be able to control those things in our simulations?
Well, most experiments are done at a specific temperature and pressure, right?
Right.
So if we want to compare our simulations to real-world data...
We need to make sure they're playing by the same rules.
Exactly. It's like we're creating this virtual lab where we can control those parameters just like in a real experiment.
Got it. So we've got to make sure our virtual thermostat, our virtual pressure gauge are working properly.
Exactly. But just like in a real lab, sometimes those instruments can be a bit finicky.
Oh, I know all about finicky lab equipment.
Right. So there are different algorithms that we can use to try and maintain a constant temperature and pressure in our simulations.
All right.
And some of them are much better than others at mimicking real-world conditions.
So it's not just about setting a temperature and pressure and hoping for the best.
No, not at all.
We have to choose the right algorithm to make sure our simulation's behaving realistically.
Exactly. So, for example, a common algorithm for temperature control is called the Berenson thermostat.
Okay, the Berenson thermostat.
It's like this tiny virtual thermostat that constantly adjusts the kinetic energy of the atoms to try and keep them at that target temperature.
So it's like gently nudging our atoms to keep them moving at the right speed?
Exactly. But the Berenson thermostat has some limitations.
Oh.
It doesn't always maintain the correct distribution of velocities among all the atoms.
Okay.
And that can affect the accuracy of the simulation.
So it's like our thermostat is a bit wonky and might not be heating the room evenly.
Yeah, something like that.
Some spots are too hot, some are too cold.
Exactly. So other algorithms, like the Nose-Hoover thermostat,
Nose-Hoover,
they actually do a much better job of replicating the correct statistical mechanics, and that ensures that our simulated system is behaving according to the laws of thermodynamics.
Got it. So just like with everything else in MD simulations, it's all about choosing the right tool for the job.
You got it. And it's fascinating how much detail goes into controlling even these seemingly simple parameters.
It really is. And it makes me appreciate all the work that goes into making these simulations as accurate as possible.
Absolutely. And we're not just simulating simple boxes of water anymore. We're looking at proteins, DNA, materials, even entire cells.
Wow. We've come a long way from those early days of MD simulations. And speaking of complex systems, I'm really curious to learn more about how force fields have evolved to handle the sheer diversity of molecules we see in the real world.
That's a great topic.
But I think we need to take another quick break.
Yeah.
And then we can come back to explore this expanding universe of force fields. Welcome back. We've been on quite a journey exploring these force fields, the sets of rules that govern how atoms interact in molecular dynamics simulations.
It's been a deep dive for sure.
It has. And we've learned how crucial it is to choose the right force field, get those parameters just right, and handle those tricky long-range forces and temperature and pressure controls.
It's a lot to consider.
But now I'm really curious about the future of force fields, these reactive and polarizable force fields you mentioned earlier. What makes those so groundbreaking?
Well, they're really pushing the boundaries of what we can do with MD simulations. You see, traditional force fields, they're great for studying systems where the molecules stay pretty much intact.
Yeah.
But what if you want to simulate a chemical reaction where bonds are actually breaking and forming?
Oh, that's right. Traditional force fields can't handle that, can they?
Not really, no.
So that's where these reactive force fields come in.
Exactly. They're designed to handle bond breaking and formation. It's like we're giving our virtual atoms the power to rearrange themselves and make new molecules.
Wow. So they're not just dancing anymore. They're like doing molecular chemistry.
That's a great way to put it. They introduce this whole new level of dynamism to our simulations.
That's so cool. So how do they actually work? What's different about them compared to the traditional ones?
Well, they have some key innovations that allow them to model those bond changes. One big one is this idea of bond order.
Bond order.
Yeah, it's basically a measure of how strong a bond is based on the arrangement of the atoms around it. It's like a gauge that tells us how likely a bond is to break.
So instead of those bonds being like rigid rods that can never break,
Right.
we're now treating them more like flexible springs that can stretch.
Yeah.
and eventually snap if the forces get strong enough.
You got it. And another key ingredient is the use of Morse potentials.
Morse potentials.
These are special functions that describe how the energy of a bond changes as those atoms move apart. Traditional force fields use simpler functions that don't really accurately describe how bonds behave when they're stretched.
Ah, so it's like we're upgrading the springs in our model, replacing those basic ones with these fancy Morse springs that are more realistic.
Exactly. And all of this allows reactive force fields to simulate all sorts of chemical reactions, from simple bond rearrangements to complex catalytic processes.
Wow. So this is a huge deal for chemistry and material science.
It really is. It opens up so many new possibilities for using MD simulations.
That's amazing. And, we were talking before about how traditional force fields don't really account for polarization, which is that tendency of electron clouds to distort when they're near charges.
Right.
You mentioned these things called polarizable force fields.
Yeah.
Are those designed to tackle that problem?
That's exactly what they're for.
So is it kind of like our virtual molecules are wearing these stiff, unchanging costumes, while real molecules have more flexible, flowing outfits that can adapt to their surroundings?
That's a great analogy. And, those polarization effects, they can be really significant.
Yeah.
Especially in condensed phases like liquids or solids where everything's packed together.
So ignoring those effects would lead to inaccuracies in our simulations, especially if we're looking at systems where those electrostatic interactions are important.
Exactly. And that's why these polarizable force fields are so exciting. They're trying to capture this electronic fluidity, which is tough to do. But if we can get it right, it could really revolutionize the accuracy of our simulations.
Wow. Force field development has come such a long way. It's so impressive.
It really has. And it shows how much creativity and ingenuity is going on in this field.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of force fields, what's your take on where this all might be heading in the future?
I'm really optimistic. We have so much more computational power than we used to.
Right.
And with all these advances in force field technology, I think we're on the verge of some truly incredible discoveries.
That's exciting.
It is. We're going to learn so much more about the molecular world, all thanks to these amazing tools.
This has been an incredible journey. I've learned so much about how these virtual molecular dances are not just simulations. They're tools for understanding the very fabric of our universe.
It's true.
And it's clear that this is just the beginning.
Absolutely. The future of MD simulations is bright.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of force fields and molecular dynamics simulations. We hope you'd enjoyed the journey as much as we have.
It's been a pleasure.